All this happened, more or less. The war parts, anyway, are pretty much true. One guy I knew really was shot in Dresden for taking a teapot that wasn't his. Another guy I knew really did threaten to have his personal enemies killed by hired gunmen after the war, and so on. I've changed all the names. I really did go back to Dresden with Guggenheim money, God love it, in 1967. It looked a lot like Dayton, Ohio, more open spaces than Dayton has. There must be tons of human bone meal in the ground. Welcome to Positive Read-Ins. That was the opening to Kurt Vonnegut's 1969 novel, Slaughterhouse-Five. I first read this novel either at the end of high school or the beginning of university. I thought it was entertaining at the time. Revisiting the novel now, I see some shortcomings in it, so I want to talk about both its merits and things that I thought Vonnegut could have done better here, or just things I thought have perpetuated in postmodern novels that maybe should not have. However, before I continue, unlike Kurt Vonnegut, I do not have Guggenheim money, so if you'd like to support me, please check out my novel, Commuting. You can link to it in the description. First, I want to lay out the structure and style of this novel, look at some of the merits of it, and then some of my criticisms. So the style of this novel, the first chapter is written by this kind of a stand-in for Kurt Vonnegut, Jan Janssen from Wisconsin. I believe that's the line he uses. In that chapter, we find out that this book is taken a long time to try to write it. There's some reference to the fact that the writer is established already. Again, this would make sense being Kurt Vonnegut. And he's been trying to write this novel about war, but he can't. He wants to write a novel that does not glorify war. Right at the very beginning, his friend's wife is angry about the fact that he's even writing this novel. That's the same wife that is actually, the book is actually dedicated to. Mary O'Hare. So that first chapter sets up kind of the premise of this novel. So it's very much kind of metafiction. We know we're getting into a story. He even tells us right at the very the end of that chapter, it says, listen, this is how the novel begins. Listen, Billy Pilgrim has come unstuck in time. It ends like this, Potiwheat. Which is a kind of a reference to a bird that we have throughout this novel. That's chapter 1. The middle chapters 2 through 9, that's really the novel. That's really the story. And the style is very fragmentary. The whole novel is just written in these short bursts. We don't have a lot. We do have characterization, but it's not characterization in the traditional sense of a novel. It's very fragmentary. It jumps around through time a lot. Some of that is effective. It plays around with the genre of science fiction. We have some science fiction elements, some futuristic elements. There's aliens in here, so it's kind of a weird combo, taking a serious topic, the bombing of Dresden in World War II, and bringing in kind of aliens, and this ties into the idea of time and the meaning of time, something that Kurt Vonnegut was certainly interested in, not just in this work, but his other works as well. I'm thinking of Timequake specifically, but there are others. A few things that stand out that I enjoyed about this novel. There's humor in here. One of it, this line, "So it goes," anytime they're talking about death, someone dies, followed by "so it goes." This is taken from the perspective that these aliens have. I'm probably not going to pronounce their name correctly, but the Tralfmador. So that's how they look at death. So it goes, like, no one actually dies. You're kind of always alive at some point in time because you can kind of move around through time. Other little moments of, I would say, kind of interesting description, but also humor. On page 24, Don't lie to me, father, said Barbara. This is the main character, Billy's daughter. I know perfectly well you heard me when I called. This was a fairly pretty girl, except that she had legs like an Edwardian grand piano. So I enjoyed that description. Maybe it's a bit sophomoric or immature, but I found it, I chuckled at this when I read it. Other descriptions that he has throughout this book that I think are kind of brief, but kind of capture what he's going for, maybe even surrealistic. There's on page 53, he describes the German soldiers. The reserves were violent, wind-burned, bristling men. They had teeth like piano keys. So again, this accentuated big white teeth kind of showing their virility, the fact that they're dangerous. On the page after that, he says, they had brought reserves to the front. Now they were going to take prisoners into Germany's interior. And then just one sentence by itself says, flashlight beams dance crazily. So I thought this was a great description to kind of show the chaos of this scene. So again, this book is very much minimalistic. We don't get these long passages describing things, but just kind of little brief flashes. Sometimes this is done very well, like I think in this case. Other times I wish there was a bit more. Something else I enjoyed in this novel, more so in the beginning than later, is with the jumping around in scenes of time, the melancholy of the character's life, Billy's life, really kind of stands out. And there's a few passages that show this. From there, he traveled in time to 1965. He was 41 years old, and he was visiting his decrepit mother at Pine Knoll, an old people's home he had put her in only a month before. She had caught pneumonia and wasn't expected to live. She did live, though, for years after that. Her voice was nearly gone, so in order to hear her, Billy had to put his ear right next to her papery lips. She evidently had something very important to say. How, she began, and she stopped. She was too tired. She hoped that she wouldn't have to say the rest of the sentence, that Billy would finish it for her. But Billy had no idea what was on her mind. How what, Mother? He prompted. She swallowed hard, shed some tears, then gathered energy from all over her ruined body, even from her toes and fingertips. At last, she had accumulated enough to whisper this complete sentence. How did I get so old? And I mean, in some ways, there's some comedy in that, sad comedy, but in others, this really reflects what Billy is wondering about himself when this is juxtaposed with some other scenes that we get just after this. I think the juxtaposition that makes scenes like this melancholic is the fact that we know this character has survived a war, survived a great tragedy, and then he kind of goes back to this mundane life, this mundane existence of just growing old. We see this a little later on page 37. Billy blinked in 1958, traveled in time to 1961. This is kind of a formula in this novel. The character blinks and goes to a different time period. It was New Year's Eve, and Billy was disgracefully drunk at a party where everybody was in optometry or married to an optometrist. Billy usually didn't drink much because the war had ruined his stomach, but he certainly had a snootful now, and he was being unfaithful to his wife, Valencia, for the first and only time. He had somehow persuaded a woman to come into the laundry room of the house and then sit up on the gas dryer, which was running. Later, he's caught. We see his kind of disgrace for this. Then he's drunk in his car, and he can't find the steering wheel because he's in the back seat. Again, some of the humor there. So this is how the character is characterized, really, through these little snippets. Again, maybe one more that I thought was effective, maybe the most effective one, is on the night of his daughter Barbara's marriage and honeymoon. He went into his daughter's room. Her drawers were dumped. Her closet was empty. Heaped in the middle of the room were all the possessions she could not take on a honeymoon. She had a Princess telephone extension all her own on her windowsill. Its tiny nightlight stared at Billy, and then it rang. Billy answered. There was a drunk at the other end. Billy could almost smell his breath, mustard gas and roses. And that's a theme throughout this idea of this bad breath being mustard gas and roses. It was a wrong number. Billy hung up. There was a soft drink bottle on the windowsill. Its label boasted that it contained no nourishment whatsoever. And again, this is a style, that last sentence there, kind of unnecessary, just kind of a random thing about, obviously, it doesn't actually say that there's no nourishment whatsoever, but, little lines like that, like in the opening with the human bone meal in the ground. This is a way that Vonnegut ends a lot of his images with some kind of summative idea. Some things that didn't work so much for me in this novel, besides, as I said, there's not many characters that are developed. In that opening, we do get Billy's character, we get some scenes of him, but we don't really get any of the other, his wife, daughter, anyone else really. Then we get these other characters very briefly that just make kind of short appearances. Kilgore Trout is a science fiction writer. He also appears in other Kurt Vonnegut novels. I think he's another kind of stand-in for Kurt Vonnegut. And interestingly, maybe as a bit of self-criticism, the writer, in this book, they say that Kilgore Trout has great ideas, but he's not a very good writer. So maybe that's a little self-criticism towards Kurt Vonnegut himself. We get the idea of sci-fi. Why the sci-fi element? So in some ways, there's a need to explain why we have this in here. And we get this in one passage. So he says, Rosewater, this is another character who introduces Kilgore Trout's work to Billy. Rosewater was twice as smart as Billy, but he and Billy were dealing with similar crises in similar ways. They had both found life meaningless, partly because of what they had seen in war. Rosewater, for instance, had shot a 14-year-old fireman, mistaking him for a German soldier. So it goes. And Billy had seen the greatest massacre in European history, which was the firebombing of Dresden. So it goes. So they were trying to reinvent themselves and their universe. Science fiction was a big help. Rosewater said an interesting thing to Billy one time about a book that wasn't science fiction. He said that everything there was to know about life was in The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoevsky. But that isn't enough anymore, said Rosewater. Another time, Billy heard Rosewater say to a psychiatrist, I think you guys are going to have to come up with a lot of wonderful new lies, or people just aren't going to want to go on living. So it seems to me that Vonnegut is trying to justify why he's using these sci-fi elements in this novel, and he's doing that through the characters. Again, very postmodernist technique to kind of speak to the readers through the characters, very much aware of the inner workings of a book. Another potentially interesting, though I thought kind of random detail is Billy Pilgrim. He knows when he's going to die. He's seen his death several times. I think there's a lot of interesting things that could be done with that concept and that idea. But this is how Kurt Vonnegut handles it. He says, Billy Pilgrim says now that this really is the way he is going to die. This being that this guy, this soldier who was in Dresden with him, wants to get him back. And is going to hire someone to kill him later in life. As a time traveler, this is Billy, has seen his own death many times, has described it to a tape recorder. The tape is locked up with his will and some other valuables in his safe deposit box in the Ilium Merchant Bank and Trust, he says. I, Billy Pilgrim, the tape begins, will die, have died, and always will die on February 13th, 1976. At the time of his death, he says, he is in Chicago to address a large crowd on the subject of flying saucers and the true nature of time. His home is still in Ilium. He had to cross 3 international boundaries in order to reach Chicago. The United States of America has been balkanized, has been divided into 20 petty nations so that it will never again be a threat to world peace. Chicago has been hydrogen bombed by angry Chinamen. So it goes. It is all brand new. So we get this kind of alternative reality, this alternative world. America is balkanized, it's divided up in all these countries. Chicago was hydrogen bombed. It's kind of random, it's mentioned, and then it just moves on, and there's no other details to really show that why we would be going in that direction as a country. So, maybe it's playful, certainly, but I wasn't believing it. Another detail that I thought was a little too playful, or maybe a little too silly, was the death of Billy's wife, Valencia. Again, she's not really developed that much as a character, so there's not much stake in her dying. But on page 9 at the beginning, it says, "Here is how Billy Pilgrim lost his wife, Valencia. He was unconscious in the hospital in Vermont after the airplane crashed on Sugarbush Mountain, and Valencia, having heard about the crash, was driving from Ilium to the hospital in the family Cadillac Eldorado Coupe de Ville. Valencia was hysterical because she had been told frankly that Billy might die, or that if he lived, he might be a vegetable." I'm going to skip over some a paragraph here, but essentially she gets into a car accident, but drives off without a muffler. It says, "When she arrived at the hospital, people rushed to the windows to see what all the noise was. The Cadillac, with both mufflers gone, sounded like a heavy bomber coming in on a wing and a prayer. Valencia turned off the engine, but then she slumped against the steering wheel, and the horn brayed steadily. A doctor and a nurse ran out to find out what the trouble was. Poor Valencia was unconscious, overcome by carbon monoxide. She was a heavenly azure. 1 hour later, she was dead. So it goes." And that's it, right? So we're told to believe that she got into a car accident, the mufflers fell off, she drove the rest of the way, breathing in carbon monoxide, and she died there in the parking lot. Again, it's a bit too light, a bit too silly. Silliness, in part, is an aim of the book. There's some, and sometimes it's done well. There's some pictures here, one being this one. An interesting connection with this one that I like, though, is, so this is this fictitious actress named Montana Wildhack, and she has this keychain that has this kind of generic kind of words of advice, right? God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom always to tell the difference. Cliche, but certainly true, or maybe a good, the idea behind it is helpful, I think. And this is actually what Billy has up on his wall in his office. We found that out earlier in the novel. So I thought that was a nice connection between these different worlds that are going on in this book. Well, that's my take on Slaughterhouse-Five. Thank you for watching.